Welcome, everybody. I'm Bruce Feldman, and I'm here today to talk to you about using generative AI for supporting capture. I think we're past the point of saying just emerging consensus when it comes to talk about using generative AI for proposal development. It's widely used now. I think we all understand the value proposition for writing both more and better proposals, winning more, as well as bidding more using generative AI. But when it comes to capture, that's an entirely different situation because capture is very unlike proposal. And so what I want to talk about today is how we can use and apply generative AI to capture related problems. So I'm going to give you today a brief introduction into basically how you can assess where you'll get the most value in applying generative AI into your capture process, some tools for doing that, a roadmap to capture key milestone type activities, key use cases. I then want to show you how to apply generative AI to some of those capture best practices, be they generic ones or those that you've developed for your own company. And by that, I mean speak specifically to the kinds of information you'll need, how you're actually going to do the processing, how you're going to engage with the chatbot and write prompts that will enable you to build a prompt library to do your actual capture. And then finally, some discussion on how to win and capture with overall strategy and artificial intelligence. So by way of introduction, let me just remind you all that capture is very, very much different than proposal-related work. Capture is unstructured and information intensive. As people say at Lofeld, best informed wins. And how we act on that information is key to winning. Uh, the information that you use in capture is largely unstructured. It comes out of a wide range of different types of documentation, company documents, public sources, business development reporting, all these different kinds of information need to be processed, ingested, synthesized in order to draw some conclusions and make some inferences about an upcoming solicitation and to act on that forecast. I'm going to talk at some length about how you should set up a searchable, secure enterprise library for your people if you don't already have that, as well as for generative AI use and application. And then I want to get into prompting techniques. Now, we at Lofeld teach a class on generative AI proposal professionals. We talk a lot about prompts, but in the class, we do a lot of work with engineered prompts, prompts that you might have in a library you would reuse to generate high quality proposal content. For capture, we want to talk about those prompting techniques in a different sense, about actually writing and really trial and error testing to improve prompts that will enable you to create capture artifacts that in turn become the essential feed for your proposal process. So let's talk about how we actually apply generative AI to capture tasks. Now, the key difference between capture and proposals is related really the two, if you will, superpowers that generative AI has. I think we're all pretty much familiar with the idea that generative AI is impressive at writing coherent, grammatically correct, well-structured responses. You can give it a prompt, it will come back with a cogent response. And by the way, the capabilities really have evolved significantly just in the last 2.5, 3 years since generative AI became prominent in the public mind and public awareness. Today, what we see are really very high quality responses being prepared. I would contend that you're not ready yet, at least, to have it write your proposals for you to generate high quality winning proposals that will score strengths. But certainly with human intervention, our ability to generate high quality proposal content has really improved quite a bit in the last few years. The other thing that generative AI can do really, really well that is perhaps less well appreciated is that you can input to it lots of different types of unstructured text data. And by the way, I'm not talking about graphics or music or video. We're just going to really talk only here about text. We can give it all these diverse inputs, and generative AI will basically accept those inputs, process them, and then we'll process them in such a way as to be able to draw inferences and conclusions from those diverse sources of information, all within a single session, a single conversation or dialogue between you and the chatbot. That's an understated and underappreciated capability that generative AI can do that. And it's very much applicable to capture. So let's be a little bit more specific in contrasting using generative AI for capture versus proposal related work. As you can see in the top set of words here, I mentioned just on the last chart that generative AI is very good at ingesting and taking information from different sources and then doing analysis upon them. Okay. Capture is very much that kind of a process. We're dealing with unknowns. We're trying to resolve unknowns and then reshape and influence customers to address those unknowns in ways that perhaps they hadn't previously considered. As Lofeld says, best informed wins. And how we act on that information is critical to winning. You can certainly win or lose your proposal in capture. You can write a brilliant proposal, but if you haven't done an effective capture, you are still unlikely to win. And so being informed, we have found, is the key toward winning. And by that, I mean developing an effective strategy, having an effective influencing and shaping approach to dealing with customers, especially in today's environment. We'll talk about that in just a moment. And then really forecasting the likely requirements, building and vetting preliminary solutioning and strengths that will help you write that high scoring, effective proposal. Proposal development, on the other hand, is very much a different process because it's highly structured. You have customer instructions, you have customer requirements, you have a schedule, you have all these things you have to address. You have a preliminary solution, hopefully, that you've put together during capture. So now it's real more about taking those different inputs and synthesizing them into a highly effective, high scoring narrative, if you will, synthesizing the actual narrative content. Okay, so we have a number of things we do there with generative AI as well. But the point is, it's very much a structured process. And that's a significant difference between the two. Now, as you think about how you might adopt generative AI to help you in capture, consider the capability maturity model. By the way, that's a registered trademark term, capability maturity model, trademarked by the Project Management Institute that invented it, really primarily for software development and later for systems engineering some time ago. But you can also adapt the same construct, a capability maturity model or a growth maturity model for business development as well. And in fact, that's been done. I'm showing you one here on this chart. Yeah. And the idea is that in each of these areas, you can evaluate where your company is in terms of its maturity. And I'll show you on the left of the chart here, on the left of the visual, you can see at the bottom we've kind of an initial phase where really your processes and your work is largely ad hoc. Somebody hands you a document, you invent how you're going to attack it, and then you proceed from there. You can mature your processes internally, and there are techniques for auditing and self-assessment. You can mature yourself all the way to where you're optimized, where you not only do you have well-defined processes, but you have continuous process improvement built in, you have automation built in, so you really generate consistent, high-quality work, really with minimal reinvention or the need to reinvent or invent for the first time processes. And that's much more cost-effective and efficient to do that. And there are a number of silo areas you can see across the top of the chart: customer and leadership, people, process management, support, different areas or different silos in which you can apply this kind of maturity model thinking. And then you have a number of areas where it's the actual process areas. You can see on the chart under innovation and transformation there. And so what you're seeing now is laid out by each of those different maturity levels, ways to think about your internal processes and to assess them. The reason I suggest you consider these is because you're going to find when you bring generative AI on board and you start using it for capture, you will evolve quickly to many, many use cases, a lot of different demand signals, and you won't be able to do everything you might want. So in advance, assessing the maturity of your systems and how far generative AI adoption could then help you jump, leapfrog, process stages to a higher level of maturity is a very powerful thing to be able to do. And so the chart is conveying that idea to you here that you can self-assess. Look for those areas where you get the most return on investment from your generative AI investment. And then you can adopt in those use cases first, put them to work, and then gradually over time expand that universe of capabilities and applications that you want your company to be able to implement. Now, as we talk about best informed wins, let me just point out that right now we are in a very dynamic time when it comes to capture. And that's because of the FAR revision process that we're undergoing right now, where the government is issuing deviation guidance where you can update and instantly implement, in other words, make mandatory a revised section of the FAR. That's happening right now. And there are a couple of core themes. I know that Deltec has spoken extensively to that and is conducting webinars on that subject you might want to consider attending. One of the key themes we see emerging out of the FAR revisions is reducing the amount of mandatory direction from the federal government to the GovCon community, and instead giving greater authority and responsibility at the acquiring agency level. empowering contracting officers to decide how they want to proceed. Now, having said that, giving contracting officers more flexibility is a good thing, but it is, by all means, a two-sided coin because the more flexibility they have, the more variance you're going to see between customer agencies. You need to be prepared to deal with that. And so having a capability like generative AI will enable you to respond more quickly when you see things that maybe traditionally have not been the standard as they emerge out of those acquiring agencies. You're also going to see preferences. For example, there is clear preference in the FAR revisions for purchasing commercial products and services whenever possible. I think the word maximizing is used in some of the FAR revisions. The goal is to maximize acquisition of commercial products and services. That's very important. If you have a commercial offering that would fill a need, and you feel that the government is perhaps going about it through a custom or bespoke solution, you can go and talk to the contract office and say, hey, commercial product or services available to you as an alternative, and that should be prioritized per the FAR revisions. You're also going to see increased evidence, and I think it's not going to see, it's already happening, where the government is going to direct you to use GWACs and best-in-class contracts and also use non-FAR vehicles when appropriate. And that, especially with the best-in-class contracts, that area is going to be emphasized. If you can use a best-in-class contract, the government's going to preferentially acquire through that contract. So it's really important you win and acquire access to these key contract vehicles, which are primarily coming out of GSA, out of Government Services Agency. So we need to respond. We will need to respond to the FAR revisions in particular during capture. And by the way, when I say FAR revisions, I also really am including the executive orders and related guidance, all which are part of the GovCon procurement universe of things that are happening right now. But the FAR revisions, I think, is very, very visible and very, very systematic. We're going to be having to engage more with customers. Given that COs and program offices and acquiring agencies are going to have greater authorities and more flexibility, it's more important than ever that you be speaking with those people, acquiring information from them, and vetting your solution with them, which of course, is done during capture. For small businesses, you're going to have more engagement with key offices like Competition Advocate, Small Business Liaison, SBA, Small Business Administration. And again, generative AI can help you with all that, but it's going to become an area of emphasis. So again, we have more of what's going on informally behind the scenes that will influence acquisition strategy and outcomes. So you, as GovCon companies, will need to update templates, make sure you're tracking the FAR revisions and clauses. There certainly are a fair number, I think probably at least 20 FAR parts that have been revised. You should, make sure you know what's going on with those and how they have changed. And when you are surprised, when the government comes out with an acquisition strategy that you do not expect, you'll need to be able to respond quickly. And one of the great virtues of generative AI is it enables speed. We talk about increasing employee productivity, people working on proposals in particular by 30 to 50% or more. Part of that means getting things done more quickly. So when you are faced with a change you didn't expect, you can now respond more quickly with generative AI. And finally, we're going to have to assume that industry is going to become better at managing its own information. You're not going to be able to rely in the future to the extent you may have in the past on what I would call tribal knowledge, where information is held by a group of people who share that information based on their availability, their awareness of what the needs are. Every company, regardless of its size, is going to have to set up an enterprise library of documents that are your policy, your past performance, other key documents that are really part of your corporate knowledge base. And of course, you want it to be searchable by people. That will continue to be the case. But you also want it to be searchable by AI. So as you consider all these things that are part of our assumptions for the future here, consider, have you already adopted GenAI or you have or have not? I think we're seeing that the gap between them is going to be widening, even as companies of all sizes, from the smallest to the largest, are adopting generative AI and using it now for proposals, soon on capture, if not already. And then finally, consider that the field is continuing to evolve. We're seeing for instance, for searching data and finding data more quickly, you may have knowledge repositories using retrieval augmented generation, semantic search called RAG. You may have other techniques. There are emerging technologies as well. Knowledge graphs is just one example of that. That's a technique which enables you not only to retrieve information from documents based on its similarity to your need, to your request, that's semantic search, but also to search out relationships between entities and understand how things relate to each other. Again, a very powerful potential application. So let's consider some use cases for generative AI application during capture. Now, this picture here represents the Lofeld capture roadmap that's used in the capture management training. And what you see are 10 different milestones here, 10 different key activities in the roadmap. And the training covers in depth each of these different areas. I've identified six where there is immediate application of generative AI to a capture related task. That's not to say the others can't be applied. Yes, they absolutely can. But I picked six, which I think are the most obvious and will also give me an opportunity to give you some insight into different techniques for generative AI and how you might do it, different ways to prompt or engage with a chatbot in particular. All right, so our first capture milestone or task is assess risk. This is something we do throughout the capture process. Now, we want to consider risk in terms of what is the risk that our proposal will score weaknesses and not score strengths. That is the undesired outcome. We want to score lots of strengths or high confidence with an absolutely minimal, if not zero, registration of weaknesses and certainly zero deficiencies. So the customer views uncertainty, lack of confidence, additional oversights as factors in risk. Those are things they don't want to have to do or have to deal with. They want to have high confidence and know that when they select you, that you will be able to deliver on your promises. And there are various techniques for managing risk. You can see a kind of a systems engineering style process at the bottom of the chart. You have to identify risks, analyze them, determine how you're going to manage them, how you're going to mitigate and lower the risk, and then put that into your proposal narratives. So those areas where you think the customer might sense some lack of confidence or might have some sense of uncertainty, they are confident that you recognize that and you will deal with that during execution in a way that addresses their concerns. So what I'm going to do for each of the six use cases that I'm going to talk about here, I'm going to show you what kinds of information you need, how you might apply generative AI to the problem, and then where you would take the product or the artifact that emerges from your work with the GenAI. And by the way, GenAI and human as collaborator. We don't work for generative AI. It works for us. It's an assistant. We're not even quite a collaborator, I would contend. But regardless, we take that output and then we put it to work somewhere. So we're not just doing things for their own sake. So you're going to see in the source information graphic at the left, I'm going to tell you what kinds of things you might want to look for and make sure you're putting in your enterprise library, your corporate library, that are always going to go in there, regardless of win or loss, regardless of outcome, regardless of where it's coming from. You're also going to be developing content specifically for the capture, which is going to go into that same source repository. And the reason we do that is to make that information available to both the people and to the generative AI platform. It's going to pull information out of these different sources here and apply it to a set of tasks that are shown on to you on the right over there. And then you're going to see here, for examples, for assess risk, right? We're going to characterize risks and mitigations, come up with risk factors, look for areas where we have historically underperformed. I'll talk about that in just a moment. Okay. And then look at similar evaluations with the same customer of previous proposals, where maybe you went in, wrote your proposal, had your corporate standard practice or a bespoke practice, and you were scored a risk or you were scored a weakness. And how do we identify those systematically across the enterprise and then make sure we have mitigated those? Now, I mentioned record of underperformance. You'll see a note on the source info about CPARS reports and award fee debriefs. That's an example I'm going to use here right now, the CPARS reports. So the CPARS system is the Contractor Performance Assessment Rating System. When you have a program, you are receiving CPARS. If not CPARS, you might be receiving award fee debriefs or other sorts of feedback. But CPARS go into an enterprise-wide, for the government, database. You receive copies of your CPARS, but government evaluators have access to CPARS that you may have received from anywhere in the acquiring agency or outside the acquiring agency, and the government can use those in their evaluation. Typically, they will give you some insight into whether or not they plan to do that as part of their evaluation plan in Section M in the solicitation, by the way, the evaluation factors, or the basis for evaluation. So each CPAR report contains a report for the last period of performance on your contract. It might be 6 months, it might be a year, and there are some set feedback areas and then some narrative response in there that kind of describes what other issues might have been over experienced by the government, what their impressions were, and what you might have needed to do to overcome those issues. That's a very powerful source of information because you know evaluators are going to be looking at that sort of thing. And so you want to make sure you anticipate the evaluators looking at your CPARs and take steps during capture and in the proposal to make sure that whatever persistent problems they might have seen have been addressed. So we can help use GenAI to help us do that. We use GenAI to help us mine that library of CPARs that you have, identify areas of weakness, whether it be persistent or some of you may have only happened, once or twice, some limited number, but maybe for the same customer, for the same customer agency. And then from that, then we will develop action plans to mitigate those risks. We might make investments, we might create new processes, we might go back and, have further exchange with the customer and solicit more feedback. There are things we can do to address those areas of concern. So this is a graphic to illustrate for you the prompting technique. I don't want to make this too complex. Each of these big blocks is a step in a process. Okay, it's really not that hard to do. What's interesting about the prompting technique I want to talk to you here about is that you can tell GenAI chatbot what you want to do, and maybe even give it an example of what you want to do, and then instruct it to write the prompt for you. So you don't have to actually go about trying to figure out the exact language because GenAI is language driven. You don't have to worry about drafting the exact language to get the outcome you want or do all the trial and error that might be as you massage the words and try different things out. You can just outline the problem for the AI, put that in and say, now, create a prompt for me that will instruct you to do this. You can do that. It's what you see in the left-hand block there, right? It says prompt the GenAI chatbot to draft a prompt. And I'm giving you even a little bit of an example here from a proof of concept that I've done on a chatbot to say create a prompt to identify areas for similar programs on our CPARs where we underperformed. In other words, it's going to go out and look for areas where it received an unsatisfactory evaluation. And there's some amplifying information that I gave it there as well. I told it what output format I want. I emphasized what I want all the unsat CPAR score items addressed. You can customize that any way you like. Okay. I also say, give me the verbatim text. That's very important and very helpful. Okay. And so what you see then in the upper right-hand block is the GenAI responds. It will draft a prompt for you. And a prompt is, the set of instructions that you will give back to the AI to say, okay, let's go do this. Go run this prompt. Okay. And you can do that. And in fact, I even say here, tell GenAI, run the prompt. You just type that in, literally run the prompt. Okay. And if there are branches in it, or perhaps you might say, enter some input, I'm going to wait for you. Or you might say, if in one condition, yes, if other condition, no, maybe you loop back. Okay. But it's all done in natural language. It's not computer software. It's not computer programming. It's like really talking to a smart but inexperienced intern. That's how I think of it as a model for how I'm going to engage with the GenAI. Let's look at another capture use case. This is develop and manage customer relationships. Again, it's another area of performance that we address in our capture management training. Now, we happen to use what's called the Challenger sales methodology. Challenger is a trademark technique. You could find information on it out there on the internet, and there are YouTube videos and things like that. It's a five-step technique that is favored for when you are engaged in selling and influencing a buyer for a fairly complex set of requirements, especially if they're complex and moving, and there's ample time for engagement. There's some attributes of the acquisition that are helpful and applicable, which I think are very, very frequently found, especially in GovCon. And so we have the different steps here. And our goal then, through this sales methodology, this technique, is to build knowledge and information understanding about the customer. You might fill out, for instance, an org chart and might characterize our relationships with the different customers and identify key people who will be influencers in the acquisition, stakeholders or selection authority, the actual evaluation board, those sorts of roles. So how might we use GenAI to help us with this? Well, we have our source info. Again, we have our same enterprise library, but now I'm noting to you in the source info that our Challenger methodology is documented in there. We want the GenAI to know about how we're going to use Challenger and what it is. If you have company brand or marketing information, that might go in your source library as well. What is the external face we present to the community? Because as you have conversations with the customer, you don't want to be in conflict with what you advertise or represent on your website or otherwise to the public. And then capabilities with your company. And those might be internal, proprietary, might be those you advertise. Either one's fine for your application. Okay? And then there are some things you'll have to build up during capture as well. Your knowledge about the customer from BD reporting, from going to industry events and hearing people speak, those sorts of things. Things that perhaps your BD and customer engagement professionals have learned from talking to key players, what's really important to them, what are their preferences. I'm going to show you in a later chart here how you can use GenAI to forecast a future RFP scope. Okay? It's just an estimate, it's preliminary, if you will, but it's a place to start your solutioning, and it's all useful input for helping you come up with a understanding of how you are going to engage with your customer. Okay? And you can then go and use the GenAI to do a variety of things to plan and practice customer engagement. So you can actually plan your engagement strategy. I showed you 5 steps. Those 5 steps obviously take place over time, and you mature from step 1 to step 2 to step 3. AI can help you do that. Say, these are the things we want to accomplish. These are the key points we want to make in each step of the engagement strategy, all as input for your BD and customer engagement and capture professionals and solution architects to educate them on how you gradually over time build strong, trusted government relationships and rapport. Yeah. You can come up with scenarios with customer status and priorities. You can simulate customer engagement. I'll talk about that in just a moment. And you can review simulated customer responses to adjust your plan. And what do you do with these results from the Gen AI? You input them to your contact and call plan. People will put them to work and help you with both a call plan as well as pre-RFP solutioning. So here is, again, the same kind of a chart. Each block is a step that is undertaken in the process here. And again, I want to make it more complicated than it is. We're not doing software engineering here. It kind of looks a little bit like it, and there are some similarities, but it's all done in natural language. It's all done in, for me, my natural language is English. Okay, so in this case here, what I'm illustrating for you is you can have the Gen AI role play a session where it simulates itself. It plays the role of the buyer, the customer, and your person will play the role of the salesperson or BD or customer engagement practitioner. And you can then engage in a practice role play. And you can do it for whichever step in the challenger methodology you want. So on the left, you've got a block. You can define the role play and the input. And I've, by the way, built a proof of concept for this. This isn't notional. It's not something just, on paper. Now, I've kind of satisfied myself you can do it. So you create a scenario for the sales call. It might be what step you are, where you are in the customer engagement methodology, this in the challenger methodology. You can have a scenario where there are things that are known about the customer and things that are not known about the customer that are reflected in the customer's behavior. Okay? And you put the challenger methodology, that becomes part of the Gen AI background as well. Okay? On the right-hand side, you see how your user builds their engagement plan. What do I want to talk about at each step? What information do I need to convey and to obtain? What kind of context am I working with psychologically? How do we build trust and confidence? And then progress. And then you have a role play session. And in the role play, your customer engagement person basically has a chat session with the Gen AI where you go through a conversation. It's simulated. And at the end of the conversation, your user declares an end, we're done. The Gen AI will give you an assessment of your user engagement effectiveness based on how well you followed the challenger methodology. And you might or might not accept those conclusions, but it's designed to give people feedback on how a customer might react, especially in ways that they did not anticipate. So they can prepare effectively and quickly for an upcoming customer engagement. And by the way, writing the prompt for this takes a little bit of work. It might take, an hour, but you can run one of these scenarios in 10 or 15 minutes. And you can run the scenario. Every time you run it, you get by the way, a different engagement. That's part of Gen AI's beauty is that it's creative and it's different. There's some randomness to it, which is a good thing. And so people can really get themselves a lot of training in a relatively short order here. Here's another milestone to understand customer objectives and requirements. Again, another part of our capture training. Okay? We want to understand the customer's objectives and requirements. Okay? So we're going to try to have Gen AI help us understand what they want the solution to achieve Okay? And what the customer needs for performance will likely be in a future unwritten or maybe only partially drafted, but certainly not available to you statement of work. Okay, so how can we use GenAI to help us through this part of the capture process? And really, it's, again, very much emphasis on customer engagement here. And the outputs here, again, this strongly influences our win strategy and our technical solution. So our source info and our enterprise library is, what does the customer want in their deliverables? What are their standards for deliverables? What kinds of things have they asked for in the past, for instance, when they've done a solicitation? You can use prior proposal program samples. You can have a resume skills database. These are all, again, are relevant content for understanding customer objectives and requirements. Okay. You can use Deltek's GovWinIQ and the AI capabilities resident now in GovWinIQ to help you understand customer acquisition practices. Typically, what does this customer ask for in terms of deliverables, templates, instructions, those sorts of things? And we have the forecast of RFP scope that I mentioned before, where again, you can at least make a preliminary estimate suitable for solutioning purposes. It might be 6 months, a year, 2 years before an RFP comes out. You can build a forecast like that, which will then influence how we use the GenAI here and what the results are. And then we use GenAI to proceed through a series of steps to draft content. And that content that becomes a key input to building our win strategy and solutioning. I'm going to talk more about win strategy on an upcoming chart, but think of win strategy as the key things you need to do during capture in order to win. And by key things, I mean the investments and critical decisions you need to make. Do you need to stand up a facility? Do you need to build a prototype? Do you need to hire a certain number of people or certain people with very unique skill sets? Whatever those critical path items are for winning are really the key, the foundation of your win strategy. Okay, so this is a prompting technique I suspect many of you have heard of because it's common in proposal work as well. It's called chain of thought. You write a request to the AI, it responds, you write another request, related request, and you have a dialogue. And each step of the dialogue, you interact with the GenAI. And as you need to, you go back, you write a next prompt and a next prompt and the next prompt until you're satisfied with the outcome. Okay, so you're going to write a series of prompts. And you can do that in a process like this. Let me flip back a couple charts here. Where we're stepping through, we're going to talk about some customer info or input it to the GenAI. We're going to ask it for a requirements description. We're going to ask it for customer objectives. We're going to ask it for a breakdown structure. This is a sequence of tasks. Well, chain of thought is very powerful for that. There also are capabilities on some platforms for building an assistant where you can automate, you don't have to write prompts every time. You can automate a sequence of prompts. That would allow you to inspect the results at each step along the way, which is, I think, very important. And then you can proceed, before you proceed to the next step, and make adjustments and modifications at every step along the way before you proceed to the next actual step in the task. Another one of our milestone areas in our capture management training is influencing the solicitation, also called shaping. It's where we have engagement with the customer. We offer up our ideas that perhaps they hadn't considered, and with the desire to help them do a better job. I think it's important to emphasize this is not a manipulative thing, but it is a trusted partner input to the customer. So it's not an attempt by any means to browbeat or shape or insert. I shouldn't say shape, but we do want to shape, but not to direct or even promote too much what it is. We want to give them ideas for things that will be to their advantage that they might want to adopt. And at the same time, hopefully, will enable then our offerings to receive a more favorable consideration than otherwise. All right, so we're really trying to show commitment to the mission by giving customer ideas that they may not have considered. Okay? And along with those ideas, we need to provide evidence that change will improve likelihood of success and doesn't have to incur risk. Because invariably, the customer will see things that have not been perhaps thought through or been already experienced as carrying risk. And so we need to provide them with evidence. And in fact, you see that prominently in the FAR revisions now, where contracting officers are being charged with taking more of a risk management oriented approach to acquisition. They should be willing to accept some risk in return for the potential of improved outcome. So it's to our benefit then to suggest things that may not have been previously considered, but to provide evidence that they will work. And thereby show the customer that our company not only has unique insight, but we may have capabilities that otherwise they would not have considered. So on the right, you can see some areas of potential influence. And this isn't something obviously, you don't wait for just the draft RFP to come out. That's, relatively late in the game. As the government is considering how it might acquire and what its process might be, and as it starts drafting the solicitation deck, valuation criteria, proposal instructions, all those sorts of things that are not necessarily performance requirements in the contract, those are all areas where you should be able to give the customer inputs and suggestions. And again, the FAR revisions encourage that. So we need to take that to heart as well, that we want to really emphasize to the contract officer, we are here to help you. We're not here to tell you what to do or to patronize. So what we can do with GenAI is create leave behind materials. So again, you have your enterprise library with company content in it, company capabilities, whatever competitor insight you might have acquired in the past. You have again, your forecast of RFP scope we've talked about. You can use GovWin IQ now on the Deltek website to start gaining deeper understanding of how the customer buys. And I encourage you to do that. That's, I think, a very important thing to do. What is their typical choice of acquisition methodology? And again, we want to track that very, very carefully because based on the FAR revisions, that may change a lot in the next few years as the customers pay more attention to using best-in-class contracts or non-FAR alternatives such as OTAs and CSOs, things like that. So you can use GenAI to draft content for leave behind material. You can have it write a paper for you with suggestions for how to acquire, how to plan fee, what might be key attributes to evaluate those sorts of things. You can give them new ideas for opening the requirement space, hot button issues, all those sorts of things. GenAI can help you with that. Again, I think it's very, very important that a human being use the GenAI result as input so you get the right tone and style to come across as a positive contributor to the customer's process and not as a self-promoting know-it-all. Let's not do that. And of course, what do we do with that? We make that an input to our customer engagement plan. So when our customers are out there, they're using the Challenger or some other sales method, they have meaningful leave behind material. Obviously, you don't want to leave the customer with stuff that frankly is going to go in the trash as soon as you walk out the door. Let's make it as relevant and helpful as possible. So here's another prompting technique. This is called writing an engineered prompt. And that's when you write a pretty elaborate, detailed prompt that is designed to provide a consistent and accurate response for an influence. You might have a style you like your white papers written in, for example. Okay, we're going to give the GenAI your style. We'll tell it what the style is you want. We'll tell what kind of influence we want. We'll give it the forecast of the RFP, what the requirements appear to be, and we'll tell it what is it we want to have output in this white paper. Okay? That's the left-hand block. GenAI creates a draft white paper. The user edits and finalizes it. And again, I say edit it. It's really more participatory than that. Maybe it's more really takes that as input and revises to get it the way you want. I tell people in the GenAI Proposal Professionals class I teach at Lowfelt, you don't ever take a GenAI product and sign your name and turn it in. Not ever. Not only because of the potential for hallucination, but also because style and content matter. And GenAI is not going to get it perfect. So it's important that you read every word and decide if this is really reflective of what you want to say. We have a milestone in our Capture Manager training for developing the solution and positioning with the customer. Now, what does all that mean? It means pre-RFP, even before the PWS or the statement of work has been released, you need to be thinking about your solution and how you're going to build it. And by solution, I mean, that capability or that approach or that management model or some or all of those things that you're going to deliver in execution. That's your solution. And you wind up building it in phases. Some of you teach, I'm not going to go into too deeply here. But your goal, of course, is to not only come up with something that meets all the requirements, but to make it clear how you are different and better than your competitors. So you can score strengths and minimize weaknesses, maximize your confidence ratings. And so what you see on the bottom there in the graphic is customer requirements, corporate strategy, solutioning, strengths. You're kind of flowing from left to right there. And ultimately, that becomes a key input to your proposal process. So again, your source information in your enterprise library, you would like to have similar solicitations from your target customer office as well as adjacent offices in the same organization. Because a lot of times they will share requirements, there'll be overlap in requirements, there'll be perhaps interfaces between contracts that you need to be aware of. So that's a useful thing to be able to factor into your solution early. Customer policies, what is the customer advertising as their intent is very, very important. You'll see that at industry days, you'll see it in press releases, you'll see earnings calls from competitors, industry day information. All those are very, very important sources of information. And you can have some capture artifacts as well, your BD reports from your customer engagement practitioners, what they've learned from their conversations. It's important that those be systematically documented and captured in GenAI. And by the way, GenAI can help with that capture. So that's a topic perhaps for another day. As you make your company visits, perhaps your senior executives are going to go visit the client. Okay? Maybe a performance history with the customer. All of these need to be documented and in your library. So not only the AI, but your people can access them. Otherwise, it becomes knowledge that you might not capture in your proposal. And once you've done that, what you can do is you can have a workshop. Okay? And what you can do then is use your enterprise library and your capture artifacts to forecast scope, key requirements, evaluation criteria, do sentiment analysis, thematic analysis on those inputs. I'll show you how to do this in a workshop in just a moment. And talk about how well your company fits and where are the gaps in your offering where you might need a team or make investments in order to solve those gaps. And again, this becomes a critical input to your solutioning process. So the prompting technique you could use here, and I say could, it's not mandatory, is you can draft and manage content in a workshop setting. You have a view screen up, you have the AI online and shown on the view screen. You do based on chain of thought prompting, which we've talked about a little bit before. You should plan ahead a series of prompts that are designed to walk the attendees at the workshop through a process to solve a complex problem. Okay? And what you do is you run your first prompt, which might be, give me suggestions for technology. It might be, tell me how the mission might work. Tell me what the customer hot buttons might be. You can even go earlier, right? Tell me what the likely evaluation criteria are. Because again, that's often captured and reproduced in solicitations from elsewhere in the same customer office. There's a lot of reuse of information there. Take advantage of that. So as you generate that first response, you can kind of stop. You can use the AI then to review the output. The people in the room can add, delete, modify, park, whatever they want to do with that output, make those changes. Okay. And then proceed to the next step. Now, the advantage of this is it's very, very quicker, certainly than having a bunch of people in a room with just a blank whiteboard. Let's get started. Okay, because now the Gen AI is really giving you that first cut for everyone to look at. And you can also specify how detailed do you want it to be. Do you want it to be 10 words or 200 words? You can make that, something you control in the workshop. So then you walk through your series of prompts, editing with input from the people in the workshop at every step along the way until you have completed the task. Okay? So for forecasting, I might say, based on previous customer solicitations, information in our library, what are the likely evaluation criteria for a solicitation on the following topic? Okay, they can do that. Okay, and then your team goes through it. I find for these very early pre-RFP reviews, I mean, I'm talking a year to 2 years or more in advance of RFP release, your BD practitioner is essential. The person who's been talking to the customer is really, really essential, as well as some of the technical leaders in your company who really know what the state of the practice is and what's potential, what's been used by the customer, what hasn't been used, those sorts of considerations. All right, the last use case for capture management milestones on our roadmap is building your win strategy and value proposition. So as I mentioned before, your win strategy lays out the key tasks that you have to complete to win. And by that, I think of investments. It doesn't have to be financial investment. It can be management commitment. It can be other things as well, diversion of resources, contingent offers to keep people, which maybe don't have a financial implication in the capture. There's no bill there for that necessarily, but certainly would have an impact after award. So you want to lay out the handful of critical actions you need to accomplish the pre-RFP stage. Okay. You also would like to write a value proposition where it explains in a paragraph. It's not a 10-page essay, it's one paragraph. Explains why the customer should pick us. Okay. If you can't explain to yourself why you are different and better than your competitors, and you have to be different, by the way. If you propose exactly the same stuff as your competitors, the government's going to be forced to make a determination on price, which may or may not be where you want to be. Okay, so generally speaking, in a best value acquisition, you want to be different and better than your competitors. So to do this, you're going to build up your enterprise library. You'll have a strengths repository from your earlier solutioning effort, where you think about things, you've identified those things that you believe you can propose that will score strengths. You also identify your past performance, capture artifacts, again, that same forecast of likely evaluation criteria, requirements, those sorts of things, gap analysis, customer analysis, competitive analysis. And again, you can use GenAI to formulate those key concepts. GenAI, tell me, what do you think are the 4 or 5 key things I need to do to win this solicitation, to win this acquisition? And it'll give you suggestions. And you can say, I want 5, I want 10. And nothing says you have to do any of them. They're just inputs for your process. You can also ask it to draft a value proposition. If you have a BD, business development, domain aware platform, a Gen AI that knows about business development in particular, not a generic platform, not a Chat GPT-5, not a Google Gemini, but I mean a platform that is specifically designed for GovCon business development. And there are several of them out there. You can then have it, draft a value proposition that explains why we're the best. And that will become obviously an input to your capture plan in terms of the investments you need to act on during capture, those things you need to spend time and money on now, pre-RFP, okay, as well as influencing your customer engagement plan. If the customer you think is going to demand an investment you don't want to make, maybe you want to make the case for the customer dropping that notion. It'll also obviously affect your proposal strategy and the executive summary for your bid. So what's a prompting solution for this? I would say, develop a prompt library. If you're using a chatbot, you may already have vendor provided prompts, which are fine. Uh, they may or may not be consistent with your best practices internally. So you might want to add your own developed prompts for your own custom purposes, your own best practices to that library. But you create this library so you don't have to constantly repeat the activity by creating new prompts and expend that effort. You can identify the prompts and then apply them in the given scenario. And if you want to, then you can even do comparative prompts. Run the vendor one, run a custom one, bring up a chatbot session there again, and now do a diff analysis. Check for differences. What's different? And then ask even GenAI what it thinks are better and what it likes less about each of the different responses and have it give you input on that. And then you can create your user follow-on questions, which are prompts. You would just go into chain of thought mode at that point. All right, so some conclusions and observations. There are lots of ways for you to use, and I say business development practitioners, but I really mean also capture and proposal practitioners as well, to use GenAI platforms, especially chatbots, depending on the use case. And when I say that, I mean there are many, many prompting techniques. There are lots of different prompt templates out there. You may have a platform which doesn't demand you do any prompting at all, and that's, certainly a way to do things. Um, whether or not you can see sufficiently behind the scenes of what that platform is doing to satisfy yourself, that's a different question. That would be part of really your trade-off analysis as you try to identify what kind of AI you're going to buy or acquire or lease. Okay. But generally speaking, capture is an unstructured process. You're going to need the ability to input different types of information to the Gen AI, diverse information sources, and run prompts, whether it be canned provided by the vendor or something that you've written. So it is more than just a writing platform, it becomes an analysis and inference platform as well. So when you select your technique for a particular use case, there are some key questions you want to ask yourself. How much interhuman interaction do you want is mandatory for you? Do you need to inspect the work in intermediate steps? Or are you willing to accept whatever comes out at the end and then make your revisions there? Both methods are certainly used and accepted. Okay? It's really, a question of desire and style for you, how you want to operate. Okay? Can you get access to the external data sources that you expect to tap? So if you're using GovWin IQ, for example, can you know you're going to have access to everything that would be in SAM.gov and FPDS and some other sources. Do you have existing prompts? Or are you going to have to write them all yourself? That can be adapted to the use case. That's really a question for you again to consider. So I've given you at some length here some insight into how you can use generative AI to help you in capture. Capture being a very unstructured process, kind of hard to anticipate everything you might need or want from a Gen AI platform during capture, especially when every company really has its own best practices, those lessons learned over time. And, capture managers and customer engagement professionals all have their ways of doing things. So you can't really guarantee that anything you might want will come resident in the platform. So what I suggest you do, first of all, is consider expanding use of GenAI judiciously to capture use cases. Don't suddenly say we're going to just open it up to greenfield. You can do anything you want in here. Discipline will be required to focus on some key use cases. Okay? If you aren't using GenAI yet, get in the game. Okay, we're starting to see the emergence of haves and have-nots. I will say that if you're concerned about affordability, you should go talk to some of the vendors out there. There certainly are plenty of smaller companies that are using GenAI now. So it is possible, even if you're a smaller company, you're concerned about the overhead cost. Consider the value added of being able to bid more and win more. And finally, you might want to consider low-field consulting, GenAI training, GenAI for proposal professionals, and AI-enabled capture proposal grant assistance services for your help.